Welcome to part 3 of the menstrual cycle series. Now, let's go back and cover a little bit of what we've already learned. In part 1, we looked at the basics, including the phases that make up the menstrual cycle. In part 2, we looked at ovulation and took a closer view at what is happening inside the ovaries. Now, in part 3, we're going even more advanced and we're going to look at the hormones, which is my favorite thing to talk about throughout the entire menstrual cycle. Also in this video, I'm going to be mentioning menstrual dysfunction, or at least starting to touch on it. I plan to do a separate video for each dysfunction to go more in depth, but you're going to start to hear some of that throughout this video. Now, we're going to look at day 1. We're going to go all the way back to day 1 of that menstrual cycle. As I mentioned in the ovulation video, the follicles inside the ovaries begin receiving signals from that follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, to begin growing an egg. We see that in this purple line here. As the follicles are growing, they're also releasing a type of estrogen called estradiol, seen here with this yellow line. There are actually 3 types of estrogen produced by the body, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to call it all estrogen. Now, one of the things that estrogen does in the body is triggers growth and cell division. So it makes sense that while the body is growing an egg, it would need estrogen. But estrogen is doing so much more than growing an egg. It impacts our mood and even changes the structure of our brain. You will see why I call it this sort of second part of the follicular phase is the yes please phase, because of all the things estrogen is impacting. Now, estrogen is associated with an increase in energy, productivity, and motivation, an increase in cognitions, so that means there's an increase in memory and learning. Even verbal recall is better when estrogen's high. It also impacts mood, making us feel more confident and optimistic by boosting serotonin and dopamine. It's also preparing us for ovulation by increasing sex drive, making females smell better, have shinier hair and clearer skin. And there's actually a study that shows that while estrogen is high, females have a preference for partners, like sexual partners with masculinity cues, more facial masculine cues. Now, estrogen helps our brain process dopamine better. So people in a dopamine deficit, for example, people with ADHD, can be less impacted by their ADHD symptoms during the follicular phase when estrogen levels are at their highest. However, for other people, all this sort of energy can make us feel restless, and there's a struggle to focus because of all this energy. And also, for good or for bad, estrogen may help us gloss over details that irritate us about our partners and other people, because this sets us up for an increase in sex drive, and a people-pleasing effect can show up during this time too. Also in the cycle, the estrogen is impacting the very structure of the brain, encouraging dendrite growth in our nerves. So if I go back to like high school biology, if you remember, vaguely recall a nerve having sort of a circle at the end and then like a little arm out one end, but there's these dendrites that come out and connect our nerves to one another, and the estrogen encourages this dendrite growth. So this changes the nervous system. Now, this possibly could mean we're more aware and responsive to the world around us when estrogen is kind of riding us high. And the changes to brain structure go even further. A 2021 study that took an MRI of a female brain every day for 28 days showed that when estrogen increased, there was a greater functional connectivity across the entire brain, which means the brain was more efficient, improved cognitions because there was an increase in the flow of information, and this was the most notable when estrogen peaked at ovulation. Estrogen is also an anti-inflammatory, so low estrogen can lead to increased inflammation and increase in pain, for example, in vestibulodynia. Vestibulodynia is a pain condition that impacts the vestibule of the vulva, so check out our Sex Ed Anatomy Vulva edition to learn more about the vestibule. Now, let's jump over to testosterone. Testosterone is not usually covered when talking about female bodies, but if we take a look at this graph here, you can see the levels of testosterone shown in the blue line is significantly higher than the levels of estrogen, which is shown in the red line, for most of the menstrual cycle. The green line represents progesterone, which we'll cover next. Testosterone can make us feel more emboldened and increases our sex drive. It is also important to growing and maintaining muscle mass, energy levels, and bone density. And this is great to consider if you're an athlete and are working out, because there are more and more conversations about how to hack the menstrual cycle to get the most out of strength training and nutrition and things like that. And there are a variety of pharmaceuticals that work to suppress testosterone in the body, particularly hormonal birth control and oral acne medication. So it's important to know that when we suppress testosterone, there's a secondary effect of also suppressing estrogen. All this suppression leads to a low sex drive. It also can make it harder to add muscle mass to the body and can impact the body's ability to process dopamine, lead to chronic pain, particularly vulvodynia, because the vulva is highly sensitive to hormones, which is why we see low sex drive and mood changes like depression as a common side effect of hormonal birth control. So I wanted to point that out just because we don't know a ton of what testosterone does in the body, but we do know what a shortage of testosterone does to the body. So one of the things to consider in a low sex drive across any gender is this testosterone level. However, on the flip side, too much testosterone in the body can lead to hormonal and menstrual dysfunction like PCOS and insulin resistance, which can lead to diabetes. Now, on that super cheery note, let's jump over to progesterone. As you can see in the graph, once ovulation happens, there's a sharp drop off of estrogen levels. This is because the follicles are no longer growing an egg, so they're not producing estrogen. However, the corpus luteum begins to show up. Now, remember in the ovulation video when we mentioned that after the follicle releases the egg, it reorganizes itself into the corpus luteum, beginning the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. This is where progesterone comes into play. The corpus luteum produces progesterone, a hormone we don't know a ton about. Physically, we know that progesterone encourages the uterine lining to grow in preparation for the fertilized egg to implant into the uterus, which happens about 6 to 7 days after ovulation, and a large amount of blood flow is directed to the uterus to do this. Now, most of what we know about how progesterone impacts the body and the brain is due to actually how estrogen impacts the body and the brain, because these two hormones balance each other out. For example, estrogen is related to REM sleep, whereas progesterone is related to deep sleep and overall sleep quality. So you may be more tired and get a lower quality of sleep during the PMS phase when the progesterone levels begin to drop off. And estrogen and progesterone influence heart rate. Estrogen decreases it and progesterone increases it. This could explain heart palpitations during perimenopause because the hormones are all out of whack. We do know that when progesterone is broken down by the body, it releases a calming neurosteroid. These neurosteroids increases the efficacy of GABA receptors in the brain. GABA receptors are related to relaxation and calming activities. So if you think about alcohol and Xanax, they also work on GABA receptors. And so people report like less energy, more sleepiness when progesterone is rising. And this is why I call this phase the meh phase, because we're likely not as productive and energetic as we were a week prior when estrogen was riding high. Now, remember that study earlier I mentioned where they did the MRI for 28 days to see the impact hormones had on the brain? Now, when progesterone levels surged, there was an increase in gray matter of the hippocampus, which is responsible for learning and memory. What this actually means and translates to is still unknown. Now, if a fertilized egg is not implanted, so that 6 to 7 days after ovulation, if it's not implanted because it's usually not fertilized, the body recognizes it's not pregnant and the corpus luteum begins to regress and withdraw the progesterone. Now, I want to pause here and briefly mention hormonal birth control. Most hormonal birth control uses progestin, a synthetic version of progesterone, which is not a bioidentical match to the body-produced progesterone. Chemically, it's designed to pause the menstrual cycle by holding the body here in this state, right before the body realizes it's not pregnant. If the body doesn't realize it's not pregnant, then it doesn't ovulate. So no egg is released, thereby you can't get pregnant. So, what we mean when we say uninterrupted menstrual cycle, we mean a menstrual cycle not stopped due to hormonal birth control. This is also why it takes about 3 months following birth control for you to have a typical period, like when you stop hormonal birth control. Because remember when I talked about ovulation starting about 100 days before this whole process in the ovulation video? Think about that, is that you'll need about 100 days to get the entire process going again after you stop birth control. Now, progestin, I keep saying that wrong. I know, I'm sorry, because I'm used to saying progesterone. Progestin does not impact the brain the same way progesterone does, which means there's no increase in the GABA receptors. This also explains why anxiety is often a side effect of hormonal birth control. Because birth control only needs progestin to work, pharmaceutical companies add estradiol to combination birth control pills to try and offset the side effects of progestin. So I just wanted to stop and kind of explain how birth control impacts the menstrual cycle and where, it kind of stops it. But let's jump back into the uninterrupted cycle. So the drop in progesterone that happens about midway through the luteal phase begins to trigger our period. This is the PMS phase leading up to the day 1 of the menstrual cycle. Inflammatory cells that were sort of being held back by progesterone begin to rush into the uterus. They cut off the blood supply that was feeding the uterine lining and begin breaking down and shedding the lining, or endometrial tissue. This tissue and the blood is what makes your period and what your period is made up of. Because of the high inflammation during this time, it can lead to increased pain in people who have conditions such as endometriosis or fibroids. Also, during this time, all of our hormones drop and dramatically and can be very dysregulating physically and emotionally. In the part 1 video, we discussed how PMS impacts 90% of people who have an uninterrupted cycle, leading to a whole list of symptoms. These symptoms are a direct result of this drop in hormones. And then we start back at day 1 and the process begins again. I think it's really important to understand the impact hormones have on our bodies, brains, and emotional state. More times than I can count, I sit across from women in my office beating themselves up because of their motivation for a project just dropped off, or feeling guilty that they have less patience for their partner or children, or even struggling with their sex drive, all of which could be better understood through the context of the menstrual cycle. Many people are ill-equipped to deal with the emotional and physical impact of the cycle, but particularly during the PMS phase, because many of us did not have emotions modeled for us in healthy ways, particularly PMS emotional dysregulation modeled for us in healthy ways. And oftentimes PMS symptoms were treated as a joke and dismissed by society. Now, this is definitely not an exhaustive explanation of the hormones of the menstrual cycle, and we're still learning more and more every day about how these impact bodies and people and brains and mood. So I encourage you to continue reading and continue learning about the menstrual cycle. Every time there's more information or every time you see an article, lean into it and really get to know what your body's doing at every point during the cycle.